And without further ado, I will introduce our first speaker, who is Philomena Harrison, and she is a senior lecturer in social work at Liverpool Hope University. She trained as a psychiatrist, psychiatric social worker, but has been an academic since 1991. In the course of her career, Philomena has presented work on issues of race and mental health and race and identity at national and international conferences. We are honoured to have Philomena with us here today, and she will be discussing, which is the title of our session, our series. Her talk today is called Sitting with Discomfort. Thank you, Philomena. We're ready when you are. Please start when you're ready, Philomena.
Okay, thank you. Sitting with discomfort. For nothing is fixed, forever and forever and forever. It is not fixed. The earth is always shifting. Light is always changing. The sea does not cease to grind down rock. Generations do not cease to be born, and we are responsible to them because we are the only witnesses they have. These are the words of James Baldwin. And Baldwin was an advocate for being and staying witnesses. I feel in this series, we have been witnesses. I must begin by thanking the organizer of this series of talks and discussions under the challenging title of Sitting with Discomfort for the kind invitation to join the discussion. I would also like to thank the previous speakers in the series on their thoughts and experiences. I want to say from the start that I am aware of the contested and changing nature of all the language around talking about race as difference, or indeed any other aspects of difference. Further, I appreciate the intersectional nature of people's lives, their positioning, their standpoints, and their experience of oppression. I offer apologies where any offense or discomfort is caused or felt, but hope there is always scope for discussion, as certainly that sitting with discomfort is the very essence of our practice. In thinking about the whole area of experiences of race and racism, some questions came immediately to mind. Who is sitting with this discomfort? Who needs to take responsibility for that discomfort? Who has to live with that discomfort, and what is the impact? Who has to take action? How might the challenges be formulated? The discomfort is there in the experiences of racism, oppression, and injustice for all individuals and communities. In responding to that challenge, I want to use some personal experiences, take the risk, I guess, to explore both the sitting, which me too implies a static moment, a staying with, and the discomfort. The latter an emotional and perhaps overwhelming and visceral experience. In all of this, I don't want to dismiss the feelings of anger. I would like then to explore these moments of discomfort, to capture the learning for self and others, perhaps. In all of that, I look to finding a standpoint or a framework that troubles existing frameworks and responses. Whereas suggested in the text Feminist Freedom Warriors, edited by Chandra Mahanti and Linda Carty, we take up the challenge where we allow things to fall apart and at the same time put them back together. This will enable us to imagine something entirely different, where for us, in holding, staying with that pain, we may create something new. In saying this, we must address the question of whose responsibility is the action or the challenge. I want to begin now to explore and contextualize these experiences, starting with a narrative about myself. This is here about personal experiences, and certainly where the personal is and should be political. I migrated to Britain at the age of 15 with my family from the amazing city of Kolkata now, in India, in 1966. My family came to Liverpool. As many migrants, we had family already existing in the city. I had an uncle who was a merchant seaman who had settled in the city in the 1940s. My family settled in the Toxteth area of Liverpool, So I was schooled briefly in Liverpool and then began my working at the age of 16. I married and left the city to a small village just outside Wigan. I mentioned this was 1969, because I recall two things. One incident was the racist abuse came in the form of being called a Negro, shouted out when I went out shopping, etc., which was an interesting experience. I also had the awful experience whilst out walking with my siblings of being pelted with stones, along with racist abuse. In reflecting on this, I find it extraordinary now to reflect that in those days, we did not even think of reporting it to the police. Sitting with that discomfort. I've often described myself as a product of empire, historically, biologically, physiologically, psychologically, culturally, educationally, and even politically. I describe myself as a Black woman. I am of mixed ethnic background. My father, born in India, was described as West Indian. His father, a merchant seaman, came from Bel Air in St. Vincent and the Grenadines. My mother, also born in India, was of a mixed ethnic background. Her father was English and Irish background. I believe he came from Rochdale. And her mother was Goan, which is Portuguese and Indian. My mother recalls how her mother was barred from the English clubs in Calcutta because of her ethnicity. So I grew up in post-colonial India, in the heavy shadow of empire. My schooling was based on the British education system, where in maths we had to learn pounds, shilling, and pence. Remember, at that time, India already had a decimal currency. We had to learn both. I read Janet and John and marveled at the red London buses. We studied English history and Indian history, where in the former, the texts were filled with various viceroys and their governing of India. Britain's involvement was seen as a savior of a fractious and disjointed India. Thus, I grew up a Black, mixed-race person, imbued to some extent with the indoctrination of sentiments and beliefs evidenced in the words of Lord Kitchener, once Viceroy of India. He said, "It is the consciousness of the inherent superiority of the Europeans which has won India for us." Yet at the same time, I faced levels of racism in India as I grew up. As a child, having to sit with a discomfort that I did not understand. For example, being very puzzled at having to be involved in a school pageant about dolls from around the world and having to be involved in dressing up with the title of nigger dolls. A discomfort where race and racism left me helpless as a child. Then came arrival to Britain to face the harsh perennial winter of British racism. And this is described in this way by W. James in the text Inside Babylon, the Caribbean diaspora in Britain, something published in 1993. And not long after that, Enoch Powell's Rivers of Blood speech. My parents, as they believed, were bringing us home. They believed they had parented us as well in the ways of the mother country, giving us, as they believed, a British, nay, an English identity, an identity they had inherited and valued, and one in which they felt secure. Acquiring and accepting that identity was their passport to the future success and security of their children. Arrival in that perennial winter of British racism meant a reviewing and a revision of that sense of identity for all of us. My mother says, in a piece of research I did on the role of mothers in the development of racial identity in mixed race daughters, she says, "It annoyed me tremendously when they pointed out to me that I am not of their race. It did annoy me. I couldn't prove to them that I was. Absolutely, it hurt me and annoyed me. It annoyed me that I had come all the way from India and I considered myself English, to come to England to be told, you are not English, you are not accepted as English." Well, as I've said, she continues, the only ones that have brought my identity to me are the people here. I have seen myself different from them, and I've had to see myself differently too. In England, she had to face her changed identity, class position, and the many experiences of alienation faced by migrants from the Commonwealth. She had inherited a sense of identity, culture, and nationality that was developed in a society dominated by white supremacist cultural imperialism. We as children grew up with that sense of superiority, which was then turned on its head by the clamour and noise of "go back to where you came from," echoed in our everyday experiences of racism in Liverpool and beyond. A discomfort we had to sit with as we weaved our way through that fog to become who we wanted to be in terms of our selfhood and identity. So I guess I'm referring here to an experience where we have had to sit with that discomfort of alienation, yet grow and develop into the people we are today. I don't wish to portray a victimhood, but only the richness of a process of development, knowledge acquisition, and growth. My parents negotiated that complex field of identity development and parenting, and the changes they had to make to support their children in a new context. They had to sit with that discomfort. They had to fit us into a reimagined culture. Even in India, despite their privileged position, they knew they had to accept the rules of inclusion or exclusion based on skin tone, religion, or caste. That process they had to go through once again when they came to Britain as migrants. Toni Morrison says, "Yet dreams of home are frequently erased themselves as the originating racial house that has defined them. When they are not raced, they are, as I suggested earlier, landscape, never inscape, utopia, never home." I want to talk now a little bit about an experience in the workplace. And work can be, as we know, a context where the experience of identity can become an issue. The death of George Floyd, without a doubt, has reignited a fervour to continue the fight against racism. It has highlighted the experiences of oppressed groups to talk about the experiences of being silent and being silenced. It has, for me, has been a recurring theme in these recent times, this notion about silence and silencing. This has appeared alongside the inequalities exposed by the impact on a global scale of the COVID-19 virus. With reference to the BLM movement, I heard a woman say on the radio the other day that finally everyone was able to see the horror of what she had been experiencing for much of her life, that finally somebody would understand. This is how I felt when these issues were discussed in the context of work. Finally, someone understands my moment of discomfort. Imagine being in a context where after some years of arguing for inclusion on matters of race and discrimination in the professional training curriculum, you felt that here was a moment, and remember, in a context where all were signed up to challenging oppressions and working for social justice, where it would be easy to continue to address change. Like many other organizations, this team looked to developing a statement on Black Lives Matters. It was assumed within the team that it would be a very easy task to ask for the privileging of concepts of white privilege. I appreciate this is a contested notion. To ask to include the concepts of white privilege and white supremacy. In the event, this turned out not to be so. Even when it seemed there was no dissent in the immediate team, where what all had agreed upon suddenly did not happen in the final version of our statement. What followed was an emotional team meeting where the only Black person in the team said they now felt unsafe. This uncomfortable moment, with a lot of silences, produced a different and challenging dialogue. The emotional space, the holding of it, sitting with that discomfort, enabled team members to express their regret at keeping silent when something they knew was happening had not been challenged. They all had to explore and reflect on that feeling of powerlessness and helplessness. This had led to asking who had taken the power to make the changes in the statement and even call out that power base, call it into question. The group had to consider the impact of that moment and reflect deeply on it and act on Audre Lorde's statement. My silences had not protected me. Your silence will not protect you. Though an emotional experience and sometimes tearful for some, it was a productive experience for all, enabling the honesty and love Audre Lorde advocates in all her writing. And again, I'm sure we can recall many moments in our working life as Black academics and professionals where we have had to hold those moments of discomfort. I speak here of the times when you're assumed to be the student and not the tutor. I recall one such time when I was asked to use a different door, the one for students, into the examination hall, where I was proceeding to check papers before the exam. An administrator continued to shout at me as I continued from the back of the hall to the front, approaching me as she shouted. I always frequently these days say, I'm too old for this. I will stand my ground. I walked straight past her saying, I was not a student. I had resolved to make a complaint. I knew the administrator by sight. Before I had to leave the hall, she came and apologized. I did not, in the event, make the complaint. The point here is about how I was made invisible, that as a Black woman, I could not be the academic. Those hierarchies of lecturer and student were played out here with racial overtones. Many of my Black academic colleagues have had similar experiences. We sit with this and that discomfort. We are left to make those challenges, but challenge we must. I'm coming now to some conclusions. From those experiences, I want to say, racism is written on the body. It is written on the heart, the soul, the lungs, the throat. When I have to teach sessions on race, I teach critical race theory, intersectionality, and anti-oppressive practice. I usually begin by saying, whenever we talk about race, everyone gets upset. So expect to feel upset. You, perhaps as a white person, will have to sit with that discomfort and realize how we, because of who we are as professionals, might contribute in practice to racist ideologies and practices if we go through this reflective process of knowing and understanding the knowledge that we need to develop. More importantly, I say to students, it's what you understand about what has to change. What is your responsibility to gain appropriate knowledge? And how do you plan to make challenges where they are needed? This is what we demand of our students and ourselves. So I look again to some more specific ways forward. I read Toni Morrison's novel Jazz at a time in my life where I was experiencing much pain and difficulties. I was able to use a longing expressed by one of the characters that brought me comfort. This is how Morrison writes it. The character talks about a place already made for me, both snug and wide open, with a doorway never needing to be closed, a view slanted for light and bright autumn leaves, but no rain, where moonlight can be counted on if the sky is clear and stars no matter what. I was recently reading Mouthful of Blood, a text of essays and speeches by Toni Morrison, where to my great pleasure, she quotes this passage where she talks about wanting to see whether or not race-specific, race-free language is both possible and meaningful in narration. She talks about wanting to inhabit or walk around a site clear of racist detritus, a place where race both matters and is rendered impotent. She then quotes that passage of trying to imagine such a space. James Baldwin talks about our deeply held assumptions, our own systems of reality, what we really believe to be true, how we use that reality to judge and attack. We should consider how a white system of reality can be used to subjugate particular groups of people. Are we in a time when that subjugated reality is having to be changed and challenged yet again? What I do believe is that racism is produced and maintained through the social relations of domination. Millions have died because of their race and will continue to do so, excluded, isolated, and left powerless. We talk about a global village, yet as the work of Trin Minh Ha has pointed out, our talk now is about closing down, curtailing movements, reinforcing borders, building new fences, installing more checkpoints, fortifying security zones, sealing entire nations into restricted borders, setting up gated communities. All this when the world is connected in an instant through digital technologies. We hear those same ideas being echoed in terms of what we need to do because of COVID-19. So the questions we have to address go back to my beginning comments and questions. Who takes responsibility? Who feels the discomfort? And so on. So these are some ways forward I would advocate following any of those moments when we have to sit with discomfort. I would say we need to develop practice-based understandings of why it's crucial to address the issues arising from race, racism, and difference, taking our understanding beyond that of being able to do cultural competence, decolonizing the received ideas of professional practice. That is a challenge. That engagement in practice is evidence-based. Who are you providing services to in your area of practice, keeping up to date with the nature of our changing society? Being committed to a knowledge base that encompasses a global view of the ever-changing definitions of race, ethnicity, and culture, citizenship, nationhood, and nation states. We need to address the differing impact of racism on specific groups. We need to acknowledge that racism remains endemic in British society. As practitioners develop and continue to have discussions on the changing nature of our society, the changing nature of migration, and certainly racialized migration policies, and thus address interventions in health and social care for any individuals and groups with whom we need to work. We need to reimagine anti-racism. For me, develop anti-oppressive practice. The latter must include principles of power, social difference, social systems where the personal is political, asking critical and systematic questions about power, powerlessness, the nature of differences, and the interconnections that exist across all those principles. We have to ask those questions of our own sense of difference and that of people who use our services, creating that reflexive moment in practice, creating understandings that are historically and geographically specific. So if my mother was in therapy with you, you have to seek out that knowledge base which appreciates her specific history and context of development. Only then will you be able to construct an intervention that makes a difference to her in that moment of discomfort in any therapeutic engagement. What differentiates us is important, but we need to also address what might bring us together. We need to learn complex ways of valuing difference, not using it as a reason for domination and isolation. so that people who are different do not become our elusive enemies, but we create alliances and solidarities across all aspects of difference. To find what brings us together, keep us alive, and gives us hope. I close with the words of Audre Lorde from her essay, Eye to Eye. It would be ridiculous to believe that this process is not lengthy and difficult. It is suicidal to believe it is not possible. As we arm ourselves with ourselves and each other, we can stand toe to toe inside that rigorous loving and begin to speak the impossible, or what has always seemed like the impossible to one another. The first steps towards genuine change. Eventually, if we speak the truth to each other, it will become unavoidable to ourselves. Thank you for listening.